What is up, my ducks and drakes? Welcome to the Crowded Lake. Today we're reading chapters 15 and 16, the last two chapters of Tomorrow, a standard size fanfic by Bekka911. All triggers will be in the description, so if you don't want to be quote-unquote spoiled, you could go without them. If you would like to know the triggers, they'll be in the description along with the links to the fic and the author, so please support them. There's also a link to a Google form where you can recommend fics for the future by any author from any fanfiction site. With that being said, let's go on to chapter 15. Patton blinked. He'd had no warning when Roman had appeared in his room, grabbing his wrist and vanished them out of the main table. Neither of them had said a word. Patton had just hummed very quietly as he recognized the slight chocolate smell in the air. It reminded him of cookies and comfort. For once, Patton didn't push the memories away. Virgil and Logan were already sitting at the table. Roman sat down because Virgil pretty quickly, leaving Patton to hover at the doorway. They were giving him a choice, he realized. They were allowing him the option to run away. Again. Patton sat. Logan cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize, he said slowly, staring at Patton with the kind of intensity that made the moral side look away. After much thought, it became evident that you heard my conversation with Deceit. I wish to explain myself. I don't need you to. Patton was tired. He was tired of the lying, the deceiving, the pretending. He was tired of sitting down to a conversation that was as strained as his emotions. He was tired of being tired. He just wanted them to all be okay again. Deceit does that to you, doesn't he? He said humorously. Manages to twist your words until you say what he wants to hear? He doesn't care who it hurts. Logan sort of started. Indeed, he said uncomfortably, shifting his glasses. Listen, Virgil said, voice oddly quiet. His face was pale and carefully blank, but his eyes were determined. We were wrong to judge you for your coping strategies. I was hypocritical. I know how much support you can get from unlikely friends. Ah, of course. Virgil was talking about Derek. Patton couldn't help it. The defense tension melted from his shoulders, and he reached for Virgil's hand. It's okay, he said, voice weak. He hated fighting with Virgil. It always made him feel so guilty. And maybe that wasn't healthy. Virgil gripped his hand tightly, managing a trembling smile. Something wasn't right. Patton could see the sharp gleam in the anxious side's eyes. I want to know about your new friends, Virgil said quietly, and just like that strange light was gone and Virgil looked remorseful. Patton frowned slightly. Don't tell them, Declan breathed to his left ear. Patton wanted to protest. Why shouldn't his friends know about them? Why did Patton have to keep so many secrets from everyone? What happened to honesty? Smile for them, my dear, Dominic urged softly, and Patton did so without thinking. Virgil's lips thinned. Patton was sick of this. His life wasn't his own anymore. There were too many people deciding what he could and couldn't do, what he was strong enough to withstand. Patton knew what he could do. Patton knew what he could handle, and yet others kept insisting on taking control of his life. Patton was tired of it. Their names are Declan and Dominic, he said, surprised at how strong his own voice is. There was a snarl in his left ear. They're vocal representations over my repression and my denial. They support me, and though they're a little overbearing, I trust them. You shouldn't, Roman blurted, and Virgil glared at him. The royal had the sense to look sheepish. Patton lifted a shoulder. You're allowed to have your own thoughts, kiddo. I'm not going to shun you for thinking differently than me. He looked back to Virgil, who had a sharp gleam in his eyes again. Something was very wrong. Fine. Patton liked to play games. He could play this one too. You know how hard it is to let them go once they're your friend. He put on his best sad look. Virgil caved almost immediately. Yeah, he murmured, and his grip on Patton's hand tightened. Yeah, I know. I don't want them to go. Patton let some of his vulnerability shine through, just so that he could look desperate. And the look would disappear off Virgil's face again, and he could pretend they weren't trying to bait him into getting rid of those two people that had never lied to him. I feel like they make me happy. Except that Virgil was looking suspicious now. They were destined to do this, to dance around what they wanted to say, what they really wanted to say, forever stained with suspicious minds, with the lingering feeling of doubt. How clever they thought they were being. Patton almost felt proud that they were pulling it off. Patton, what sorts of things do they say? There it was. Patton looked to Roman, who had asked the question. They tell me not to trust you, he said simply, and Roman recoiled as if he'd been physically struck. They're worried that your actions and words are going to cause me more harm. They get me to sleep and to eat and to look after me for once. But we need you too. Anger was blooming, a beautifully dangerous burning flower unfurling in Patton's chest. Take. That was all they did, and Patton couldn't just give anymore. No, he was Adam, and he was sick of being betrayed by Eve. This was his story, his turn to decide what happened. For once, he would choose what to say. I can't trust anyone, can I? Is what he settled on. Patton squeezed his hands into fists as he felt frustration surge and mingle with the slowly building anger in him. His eyes itched. His skin tingled. I can't trust you to do what's right by me. I can't trust the voices because apparently they don't care for me either. Who does that leave me with? Deceit? Remus? Roman inhaled sharply. How dare you? He breathed, eyes blown wide in offense and righteous fury. How dare you throw that in our faces? In my face? Our Patton would understand that we are doing what's right by him. We're trying to help, and we're trying to protect Thomas. This hurt that you're drawing on right now, it's twisting you. Those voices are twisting you, and if you weren't so far in denial, you might be able to see that. Roman, Virgil snapped. Enough. No! Roman leapt to his feet, whirling around to snarl at his fellow's side. I am tired of having to be delicate. Patton can handle it. After all, he seems intent with not being treated like a child. Patton scoffed, his own anger rising to match Roman's passionate rage. Like you're any better, he said harshly, feeling any lingering horror at what he was becoming slip away like smoke on the wind. This was what those repressed feelings made him do. All that hurt had been bottled up, shoved down, and now it was molten lava that set Patton on fire and made him burn. You were so keen to fight your own battles until you lost. You turned tail as soon as Dylan showed up. You were so afraid of nothing. I was afraid of disappointing you, Roman shouted back, and yes, those were tears building in his eyes. If Patton wasn't so angry right now, he would be crying too. I was so afraid of not doing right by you that I faltered. So did Virgil, so did Logan. You want to be angry, Patton? Fine, but don't you dare turn that anger on us when you have done nothing but love you. The anger that lived in him erupted, and there was a short, sharp scream in his right ear before the roar of fire in his veins blocked out sound completely. It was Dominic who screamed, his voice cracking as the rage burned him away, reduced him to ash. "You don't know anything!" Patton cried, his fury scorching his throat. That glass bottle that had held those bad feelings had completely shattered all at once. He was swept away. Years of repressed emotions swamped him and claimed him and drowned him in hot. "You don't know what it was like to smile every day just to make you all happy. God forbid that Patton be unhappy. God forbid that Patton be anything but perfect. God forbid that Patton might be fighting for the right thing. Did any of you think about that when Thomas was fighting about the wedding? It was up to me. I fought for what was right, and then you made it wrong. You call that love?" "You call this love?" Virgil's voice was ice, and Patton's hot skin went numb. Like Logan, the anxious side's anger burned cold, and right now Patton was burning hot. "You chose two strange voices over us without hesitation. Logan was in the middle of figuring out how to help you, and you chose them without a second thought." Pressure built in Patton's head. "They made me feel okay." "Did you choose to seat over us too?" Silence. Because Patton had. Hadn't he? He'd let the seat in? Let him warp reality? Patton had chosen to seat over his friends long before his friends had had the chance to choose Patton back. "I did what I had to survive," Patton forced out through gritted teeth. "And what were you surviving, Patton?" Virgil's voice was ice. It was so cold that Patton burned in a completely different way. "What war were you fighting? Huh? What sort of battle forced you to choose to seat Declan and Dominic over us again and again until you were so sure you couldn't trust us? What sort of war forced you to push us away when we so desperately just wanted to help you?" That fire was sputtering out now, exhausted by Patton's yelling. Virgil's ice was creeping in, freezing out the rest of the heat. It didn't extinguish all of the lingering hurt, though, and Patton was so tired of hiding it. He turned on Logan, who simply looked at him. "What about you?" Patton sneered, still needing to lash out because if he wasn't angry, then he was sad. And he was so damn tired of being sad. "Huh? You sat there and you said nothing. You seem to have plenty to say before all this, worried you might say the wrong thing. I think it's a little late for that concern, don't you?" Logan just kept looking at him in that steady way. He looked completely unruffled by the fighting. "Why aren't you crying?" he asked calmly without a hint of anger or exhaustion. Patton felt his emotions sort of stumble. "What?" "Why aren't you crying? You're an emotional being, and you cry when you experience heightened emotions. Why aren't you crying now?" "Because this isn't happening," Declan sighed. "Because you're going to wake up tomorrow and things are going to be just fine." But things wouldn't be just fine. Patton couldn't outrun this. Too much had been said, too many wounds had been ripped open. Patton wouldn't be able to ignore this anymore. He had to face the fact that this was happening. He had to deal with it. "I'm not crying because Declan told me not to," Patton admitted, and it wasn't what he wanted to say. And it was only partially true, but it seemed to be enough for Virgil, who stood up and wrapped Patton up in the tightest hug he could manage. Well, I'm telling you now, the anxious side murmured quietly, the ice thawing. Cried Patton. You don't have to deal with this alone anymore. But Patton didn't want to. He wanted to be angry again, because being angry meant being strong. Except that anger had gone, had dissolved into nothing, and now Patton felt sort of hollow. Another set of arms settled around his shoulders, and a body pressed against his spine, effectively trapping him in the middle of the tightest hug, most loving hug he'd ever had. I forgive you, Roman promised slowly, voice thick with his own tears. I forgive you, Patton. Now just have to forgive yourself and everything will be okay again. Logan said nothing, but he reached out and held Patton's hand. Virgil made an exasperated noise and tugged the logical side into the group. Damn scaredy cat, he grumbled lightly. And Patton cried. Chapter 16. Love, Patton had learned, could be a poison. Loving the wrong person could destroy everything, could tear you apart and break you down and crush you into dust. Loving the wrong person lead you to distrust and lies and sabotage. Loving the wrong person meant reckless self-sacrifice and self-destructive tendency that ended in pain. Loving the right person, though, well, that had its own special kind of magic. Loving the right person brought healing and happiness, and hugs tight enough to possibly crack a rib. Virgil was like a cat. He dug his claws in, and then you were stuck with him, like it or not. Patton would change nothing. Ohana means family, Roman and Virgil yelled at the screen together with the TV cracking up as Logan let out another deep sigh. The four of them were back in Roman's room, draped over each other and curled into blankets so much that Patton thought it was rather impossible to tell where one of them started and someone else ended. Patton smiled a small smile and shifted slightly, Virgil subconsciously moving with him so that Patton never lost contact with him. Logan glanced over at him, a gentle question in his eyes. Patton shook his head. Legs asleep, he mouthed. Logan's lips quirked before he turned away. Patton scowled playfully. Traitor. I relate to Stitch, Roman declared loudly, falling back dramatically. The movie had eventually ended. Patton had missed most of it, if he was honest. Virgil shoved a fanciful side, grinning. You're literally wearing a Stitch onesie. If I didn't know better, I would think you were infatuated. Roman wrinkled his nose. I don't relate to him like that. All of them, Patton and Logan included, laughed. They settled in for Brave. Virgil snuggled deeper into his bat onesie, and Patton inhaled deeply. He felt lighter, like his body was his own again. Dominic and Dylan were gone. That he knew for sure. And he'd never felt better. He and Logan had sat down after Patton's tears had dried and talked through everything. Logan had explained. Patton had cried again. And they'd been okay. Logan had explained that Dominic had likely been the first to go. The sudden release of Patton's ignored negative emotions would have destroyed him immediately because repression didn't need to be around if Patton wasn't repressing anything anymore. Declan had hung on. It hadn't been until Virgil had confessed quietly that it would take time for them all to heal that Patton had believed him. He wouldn't wake up tomorrow feeling okay. It had been pretty quick after that. And it had taken time. There had been days where Patton hadn't come out of his room. There were still times where Virgil tensed up if Patton moved too sharply, said something too loudly, got too defensive. It would take them all time to drag themselves back to where they were, and maybe they wouldn't completely fix what they had broken. After all, you couldn't remove all the marks from scrunched up paper. They would, however, slide right back into an easy trust. Patton would say things without thinking, and he wouldn't automatically try and eliminate any possible negative repercussions. Virgil stopped carrying unrealistic expectations about Patton's attention. Roman stopped trying to hold them all together and just let them figure it out themselves. It wasn't a bad thing, because it helped them grow on their own. Logan, though, didn't change much. When Patton asked him why he didn't seem to be affected, he just shrugged and said, "I always knew we could help you." Holding on to that certain knowledge limited any possible negative aspect of change. "I simply think that we will continue to grow closer as a unit. Thomas will be better for it." Patton knew that was a logical side's way of saying, "I believe in you." But there was something else Patton hadn't managed to track down, and maybe Patton needed to dig his heels in and insist they talk. After all, deceit had been a centerpiece of the whole debacle. With a murmured explanation in Virgil's ear and a nod from Logan, Patton slipped out of the group pile and walked out the door. He'd felt a pull in his stomach moments earlier, a warning that someone was in his room. He had a good feeling who it might be. "I think we finally had a talk," he said quietly, and Deceit didn't startle. The devious side was sitting on Patton's bed, staring at his hands with a strange look on his face. Patton felt his heart ache for the side, recognizing the same lost look Virgil had held onto for too long before they'd really started to understand and accept him. Deceit looked up at him slowly, looking nervous. "No lies," he said first, almost desperately. Patton nodded and pursed his lips, slowly moving further and further into Deceit's space. It was a trick he'd perfected with Virgil. Sure enough, some of the tension bled from Deceit's shoulders. "How can you forgive me after what I've done?" Patton considered the question for a moment and decided to answer with a story. "When Virgil first came aside, I was terrified," he said lightly, settling onto the bed. He didn't reach for Deceit. Not yet. "I couldn't combat the energies he was giving off. I went with it because I like to avoid conflict. He kept pushing Thomas, kept pushing us. I didn't understand him. Why couldn't he see what he was doing to our host?" Deceit flinched. It took me a long time to figure out that he was just as scared as I was." Patton kept his voice soft because Deceit had tensed up again. Patton needed the other side to know that he understood that he'd gone through this with Virgil, and that Deceit didn't need to be scared of them. "He hid behind his name and his purpose. We let him do that, and then we shunned him for it. I've not quite forgiven myself for that." Deceit took a few shaky breaths. Patton let him be. Let him collect his thoughts. I want... Deceit started slowly. "I think I want..." Patton reached a hand across, because he knew what Deceit wanted, and he knew how long it would take the side to say it. "We'll be ready," he promised, and Deceit took his hand. "Whenever you decide you want to join us, we'll be waiting with open arms." Thank you all so much for listening. This book is my favorite in the series, and this is my favorite series, so it's like my favorite book and my favorite series. It's like the best fanfic, and I love Patton, and oh my gosh. So once again, thank you so much for listening. There is links in the description that you should totally check out to support the author and me, especially my Etsy shop, because I make things for a living and I like paying rent. One last time, thank you so much for listening, and like always, do your best.